Our guest today was born in South Africa. He went on to Eton in school, and then he went to Oxford University. Shortly after that, he went into strategic management consulting, only for a short time before he then launched lastminute.com with Martha Lane Fox. Lastminute.com, as you may know, sold for over $1 billion US, but he didn't hang out under the coconut palm trees for too long. Shortly afterwards, he then launched mydeco, Pro-Founders Capital, Founders Forum, an elite group of entrepreneurs around the world, and now Founders Factory. As well as many other things, he was awarded CBE, which basically stands for the Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, which means he's a great chap. Brent, welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Thank you very much indeed. Brent, we normally just start with what we call a sort of a quick fire round, just to get to know our guest a little bit more sort of personally. You've had $1 billion exit before. You're obviously a very wealthy individual. You've got the TV look. Have you ever thought about going on to Dragon's Den, or was that a bit naff for the Hoberman brand?
I think there are better TV formats that can come out than Dragon's Den in terms of being more supportive of entrepreneurs and not just relying on the jeopardy of that moment.
Yeah, sounds like you'll be speaking to a production company at some point soon. And do you still book minutes, sort of holidays last minute? I know that's where the name came from.
Yeah, I book less holidays last minute, I have to admit, because with a family, so three young kids, it is harder. But I still think that the idea of distressed inventory and convenience at the last minute still works in today's age too. You
went to Eton School, as I mentioned. Were you ever tempted by the front bench like some of the alumni there?
No, so far I haven't been tempted by politics. I do little bits. I'm on some advisory things, and I'm a business trade ambassador to one of the Prime Minister's business trade ambassadors, so that involves doing some work for government. But right now I feel you can have more impact in entrepreneurship, so I get more excited about that than I think politics is amazing if you're one of the absolute top jobs, but events make it pretty hard to get those.
Yeah, absolutely. You are a massively driven person, but you have come from a reasonably affluent middle-class background. Whereas playing a bit of pop psychology for a minute, if you look at most entrepreneurs, or a lot of them, they've come up from a sort of a very hard background. Where have you got your drive from?
Yeah, I find where ambition comes from, is absolutely fascinating. I think for me, in that my family was not historically very wealthy for a long time. It was actually my grandfather who started with one clothes shop. His family had basically no money. His uncle had one clothes shop in South Africa. Yeah. He turned that into 650 shops in the whole of Africa and actually in the UK. Yeah. So my ambition was because I saw that he loved what he did every day, how much he loved being an entrepreneur. I think also part of it, to quote the great Israeli venture capitalist Yossi Vardi, is why has Israel got so many successful entrepreneurs? Because of Jewish mothers. They make you feel so insecure that you want to that you're very driven to prove something to them. So I think there was something, a wonderful family, but there was something natural in the family that was always urging one to say, you've had it all right, haven't you? It's not like what your grandfather had, and and absolutely right. I still have not saying I did what he did, which is I think coming from nothing is still a lot harder. But I'm driven partly because I actually enjoy what I do every day. And the second thing is I think I'm driven by meritocracy, and I think England was, even when I was at school, a bit more of an aristocracy. Right. So I think it's changed a lot in that sense, and that there's a lot more value put on entrepreneurship and people who do it themselves rather than people who are stuck in the past. And even my old school, which I was recently on the board of Eton, used to be much more like that, but now it's a good epitome of what's changed in British society. It's an absolute meritocracy as well. The fact that I went there won't help my son.
Right. Yeah, hallelujah to meritocracy, absolutely, absolutely. So because you mentioned in there you love what you do, and I watched an interview with you in the past where you're saying entrepreneurs or business leaders that go into business to try and make money, they're just chasing their tail, going round and round in circles. It's, and that's what drives you, is a passion and a love for.
Yeah, I think these sort of mercenary people who go into business because they want to make a quick buck, occasionally they do succeed, but I think the odds are much more stacked against them than that person who's found a passion point, found a pain point, and tries to solve it and is getting up every day because he absolutely loves what he does. And that's partly because that's infectious. That passion is infectious, whereas the mercenary stuff is not infectious.
Yeah, absolutely right.
In a leader, the passion of a leader is what enables you to hire amazing people.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to make money. You go to a bank. Sorry, no offense to banks.
You talked about their sort of passion for what people do, and the founders or the business leaders that love what they do, they can overcome obstacles and they're driven, and they can. Is there any other attributes? I mean, you run Founders Forum, right? So you've had exposure to great entrepreneurs like yourself. Is there any attributes that you're thinking that they all have in common?
I think we spoke, as you said, about passion for attributes of entrepreneurs, but I think the other attribute is actually being a bit unhinged. So I've spoken about this before, that I think great entrepreneurs tend to be unbalanced individuals, at least for the time in which they are an entrepreneur. So that passion becomes an obsession. And I think it needs to be an obsession to win. So there's the competitivity as well, the competitiveness, and I think many entrepreneurs ask why they keep going. It's because they want to keep the score, right? So that's one element. But I think it's the will to win and to get around obstacles. It's tenacity would be the other thing. So most of the great entrepreneurs, everyone hits barriers early on. It's how you go around them that makes a difference. And then the other thing for me is also it's lateral thinking, and I don't think we talk about this enough. We talk lots about rote thinking. We talk about coding. Coding can just be a rote thing task too. If it's not, what's more important is to teach people how to think laterally. Yeah,
it's interesting because I got a quote here. He said, "I went to Oxford, where, to be honest, the only thing I learned was that was useful was being taught to think laterally and to cram incredibly." So thinking laterally and work hard. That's not too.
That's absolutely. I think
two pretty good foundations.
Yeah, I think it is, and university in general, but in my case, Oxford in particular, was great at forcing you to synthesize large amount of information very quickly. So that sort of adrenaline of urgency and deadlines is very much something you go through. And then what that university was very good at was, as you said, it was that lateral thing was rewarding you for thinking differently. So even before Steve Jobs said think different.
That's right.
I think British universities were there.
That's right. Because you actually say, I'll be quite honest, you need to be somewhat unhinged or psychologically disturbed to be a great entrepreneur. And is that, which is good news for me, but is that because, as you said, Mike Moritz, we were talking about before from Sequoia Capital, he says you need to be totally obsessed. You'll only invest in people that are obsessed by what they're doing, because you're willing to do the work out, the hours, is that?
Yeah, there was one great quote from another venture capitalist who said, how does he test whether he's going to invest in something? And what he does is he starts trying to have a general conversation with the entrepreneur about life or general stuff or hobbies or passion. And like the good entrepreneur will immediately steer you back to their business. He won't go on that tangent because he's not interested. He only wants to talk about his business. So I think that's a great thing. And the reason why I'm not CEO so I'm not nearly as good as an entrepreneur as I think I used to be, is because, and so I've chosen not to be chief executive of any of them, of any of the things I've done, is because I no longer want to be unhinged or monofocused. I want to go across lots of things, which is why I chair all of these things. And I try and work with people who are obsessed as I used to be. Because the trouble is now, I do think, if you're a sane person, kids can break that obsession. And I did used to say that when I was running lastminute.com, there was only one thing I was thinking about. Whenever I was anywhere, whether I was at a restaurant, I'd be thinking about how to do it better, how to get them on our site more, whether I was ordering a DVD, or I was saying, how do we get the service on the system? Everything. So the brain space for anything else was was nil.
So you've got to be willing for a period of your life to put the life out of the work-life balance thing out of...
Yeah, I think it's pretty rare you get great founders or entrepreneurs who say they have work-life balance. I think what you have to have, you get your work-life balance by loving your work so much.
You must get this asked a lot, because you must get so many pitches coming your way. But so I apologise for asking this question to you, Brent. But what is it that you look for when it comes in? Is it the idea? Is it the founder members?
I think the simplest thing I look for is, would I work for this person? So when somebody pitches me a deal, it's partly about the person, partly idea, but I think it's probably 90% the individual.
Right.
It's like, is this person exciting, driven, passionate? A salesman, I think a lot of great founder stuff is selling. The early days, you're selling nothing, right? And so it's, how do you sell that? And then it is, would this guy be an inspiring person to work for, which means he's going to be able to hire extraordinary people? Are they the sort of person who's going to hire people smarter than them and recognize that? and see round barriers, just get round those barriers that we've spoken about that entrepreneurs face.
Yeah, the creativity almost sort of going around. Because you are one of these few people that have actually built the company from sort of, from your broom cupboard, I think it was like with Martha Lane Fox. But you actually, Brent, took it further than that. You took it to, by the time you sold it, I think there was 2,000 employees there. So CEO of a big company. Are those different animals?
Yeah, they're absolutely different animals. They're exciting in a sense as an entrepreneur because you have a bigger train set to play with. So I remember being excited by the fact that there was this amazing train set. The downside was it was public, so the train set's not yours. Everybody has a view on it and how you should be using it, and there's a real short-termism. So I think the biggest change was probably being public and being short-term, less the size of the company. Although you're right, in terms of the size of the company, the problem for an entrepreneur is if you've got a bit of ADD, you do have to say the same thing a lot. So being a good manager is about saying those clear messages concisely again and again and again. I think being an entrepreneur is less about that. It's more about the dynamism of experimentation and trying new stuff.
Yeah, absolutely right. So talk about leadership for a second. There's a lot of bad leaders out there, isn't there, Brent? I mean, the Economist, who I think you're non-executive director for now, after you stepped down from The Guardian and went over to, what is this obsession with sort of being on the board or executive director of these big media groups, is there?
I wasn't, I mean, The Guardian I stayed for 9 years because I've been like reading about what was happening for the media industry and digital was a hobby. I mean, I would have read about it anyway. Right. So I'm like, it's a privilege to be to be paid to do it. And I found that The Guardian was very interesting in terms of being at the heart of that digital transformation, and you're working with smart people. I wasn't looking for another media board, and then The Economist came along, and it's a brand I have loved since university days, and it's a brand you just can't say no to. And it's also got a great business model. People pay a lot for that sort of content.
And The Guardian, I think, has become a new client of Founders
The Guardian
Factory,
has, I'm very lucky that The Guardian have invested, after my 9 years on the board, have invested, it wasn't a deal, have invested in Founders Factory, so we are helping them with innovation, and it's actually been, being on their board and some of the other big companies, been really helpful in terms of understanding how challenging it is to innovate in large corporates, and has probably helped me come up with the Founders Factory structure.
Yeah, just going back to The Economist for a second. The Economist actually said 35% of American employees would forgo a substantial pay rise if they could see their direct supervisor fired, right? So that's quite horrific. Gallup poll said that the number one reason why grade A people were leaving the organization was because of their immediate managers. So what do you think are some of the attributes of world-class leaders that get people to want to work for them?
Well, I think one of the counterintuitive aspects of world-class leaders actually is Steve Jobs, in that I didn't even want to read his biography because I had such a bad image of him as a manager, actually. So I was like, I don't want to read it. It's like, who wants to support this guy who's been so obnoxious and whatever, and succeeded by being obnoxious. But then when you read it, I actually realized that his theory of being an incredibly demanding boss, or the way he was, as being incredibly demanding, means that A players stay with you and the B players leave. So the A player is actually happy if he knows that the boss is so incredibly demanding and mean that he'll only give you a nod of approval, one sentence in 3 months, but that means enough. Right. So I think there are different types of good leaders for different types of companies and employees. So I think, and when I read that book, I thought, God, you know, all the time I was holding myself back, trying to be a really nice guy and not being as brutal as some of my instincts would have let me be. I think sometimes that was actually wrong, because you shouldn't suffer mediocrity. At least you can't suffer it in fast growth, highly competitive businesses. Yeah, but do you think Steve Jobs got away with it because of the fact that he was literally changing the world, so it was a great, it was a good place to want to be because he had the No, I think there are. No, I've seen other examples of companies that are less absolutely extraordinary, where you know, very demanding leaders do manage to build great teams because people. Actually, there are certain types of people who are so driven they only want to be with the guy who's not paying lip service to everyone, and they don't want to be carrying baggage. So I think that's the other thing. There are lots of companies where there is too long a tenure, people stay for too long. So in companies where, you know, the average people are thrown out. I'm sorry, it sounds very brutal, but actually it's Darwinian and it gets you a very dynamic, if slightly brutal culture, but that's Darwinism.
Yeah, absolutely right. And grade A people want to work for grade A people, particularly bosses as well. But you might be more demanding than you say, because at London Business School, Brent, I see you say, quote, I see my style as demanding in a way that's still encouraging. And at Google Talks, you once said, and I quote, I think my real claim to fame is in CIO magazine. I was rated as the third hardest CEO to work for the CTO, the third most impatient and most unreasonable. So, but yeah, people did love working for you. So is it a fine balance? I mean, if you're just a pain in the arse manager to work for, but you don't get the results.
I think one of those CTOs said, and I read this in some interview, he didn't say it to me, but I was quite touched that he said it. He said, he worked so hard because every time something wasn't working, I'd come over and I'd look so disappointed. But I think what that really means is everyone in the company knew I cared so much. And then the other thing was the willingness to both focus on the strategic big picture stuff, but also know in micro detail, until we were pretty big, what everyone was working on. And I still remember being able to introduce one tech guy who was having a problem with something sitting next to another guy, and they just didn't talk because they're tech guys. And I said, well, I think he's seen a problem like this 2 weeks ago. Why don't you guys talk? And in 10 minutes, this guy had solved the problem. They solved each other's problems. Right. But so it's having the CEO who cares that much about what everyone's doing. But yes, to do that, you've got to be impatient and unreasonable, and you've got to process lots of information very quickly, which means you can't always have time for pleasantries. And I'm sure I could have been better at the hurrah, you've done a good job, but I think people say I've got slightly better at that now.
But then I think, as you say, you've also got to be authentic. One of the things that, I interviewed a friend of yours, Michael Birch, and everybody seems to have got to the top in different ways. It's just that authenticity is, Michael, when we interviewed him, had a pint of Guinness when he was enjoying.
Of course.
That's just because that's Michael. He's not afraid of being himself. I suppose that's a. But do you think, as you mentioned, you didn't become the CEO of mydeco partially because you weren't passionate about interior design?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So do you think that CEOs need to be passionate about their industry? Is first question. The second question is on the CEOs. Do you think they can be airlifted? You know how Carolyn McCall went from Guardian Media Group over to EasyJet. I mean, is that a good model? Do you think?
Well, it's one of the hardest things about my job now is finding young founders where we might have ideas or where we're incubating them. So as you say, sort of parachuting them in, because it's much easier to be driven and excited if you've got the passion for it. So the early days of mydeco, I remember one of the investors said, Brent, if it doesn't do too well, will you be CEO? And I said, I'll never be CEO of this company. I am not interested enough in interiors. I would be the wrong guy. I will not have the passion for this. So, but then you're right. I mean, but at bigger companies, I think the skills are more transferable. So I think Carolyn McCall is a great example of somebody who has clearly great management skills. And so going from The Guardian, where she was for a very long time, and then transferring those skills, and arguably with more dynamism actually at EasyJet, I think those sort of management skills for big companies of getting the right people around you, building the right teams, motivating them, I think they're more transferable than getting an entrepreneur at the early stage to drive hard. We're actually organising something to help us address that, and to help do a good public service, of course, as well. We're launching something called Founders of the Future in a few weeks, which is we're using peer review and artificial intelligence, so big data, to work out what are the criteria of good successful entrepreneurs, and then reverse engineer that into younger people and say, right, you are under 35, you've never started a company, you've never raised more than $500,000, we think you're going to be a top founder, and we're going to bring you into this network of other people who we've identified of having the characteristics that mean that they should launch a business.
If we can just airlift back to huge companies for a second, you have been on the board and non-executive director for quite a big of the, a lot of Talk, Guardian Media Group, etc. In our interview with Tom Peters, he said that very easily large companies can become, and he quote, the cathedral of dullness. Right? So what advice do you give time and time again to those large companies that are trying to make sure they're constantly being driven or exciting places to work?
Well, there's a couple of things. I have a few cliches I've developed. So one of them is HR is the enemy of innovation. Yeah. And by that I mean the way human resources structure pay deals, and the way HR rewards you for consensus thinking, and doesn't reward risk-taking in the same way. It rewards the guy who cuts costs very simply, knows how to do that. It doesn't know how to reward the guy who's taken a brilliant risk that may not have worked out, and maybe the next one will work out. And that's where equity packages for startups work, and corporate HR doesn't. And the second I guess, cliche I have for the corporates is ROI is the enemy of innovation.
Okay.
So often the brilliant corporate manager will be extremely focused on return on investment, just as his investors are focused on return on capital employed and all of these things. But actually, ROI does not help you launch the smartest ideas because you don't know how they're going to pan out. Some of the best things I've done in my career, I've not known what the revenue model might be. And that, therefore, a corporate would never agree that. And the last thing I say to corporates, I often think back to my time when I was running lastminute.com, even as a CEO and co-founder, I felt that the challenge was, would my 25-year-old self still want to work there? And the key test of that is if I'd had a great idea within that company, would I be able to implement it? And I think that's the challenge with these companies, is that people can have great ideas and they can't go anywhere with them and they get extremely frustrated. Now that's where, fortunately, Founders Factory exists, of course. So Founders Factory that we've just set up has been based on some of those learnings of my own experience of running a large corporation, then my experience of sitting on those boards, as you've said, and seeing how hard it is to do innovation in those companies, and not because management are foolish or stupid, but because their structures are not set up to do that. They're not set up to disrupt themselves, and they're not set up to reward innovation in that way, and they're not set up necessarily to attract the right sort of talent. So Founders Factory is an arm's length company that will be backed by 6 corporates, 1 per vertical, and will incubate companies and accelerate others for them, meaning that at the end of 5 years, we should have stakes in over 200 companies which we've either accelerated or incubated.
Right.
And we think that'll be a great way for corporates to be in touch with innovation and for us to move the strategic needle for them. And also they'll be seconding people to us. They'll be having their young, bright sparks with ideas. We'll be feeding those into this company. And we think this company will be a hive, a talent magnet, basically.
So talk about Founders Factory. So explain to me how it works. Because I go onto the website, and basically, if I see myself as an entrepreneur and I want to pitch myself to be in this amazing Brent Hoberman or Founders Factory environment, then I can pitch. Alternatively, if it seems like you're doing your own businesses and launching those, and then there's also a third tier, which is obviously the Guardian Media Group comes to you and says we want to be in line, in touch with the new things that are coming about. So are those 3 strands, or is it all businesses that are...
It all sort of works together, but basically we work with the corporates in each sector and say, look, here's what we've seen. We'll do a call out and say, right, for media companies, for example, the Guardian will say, anyone who's got brilliant ideas for media, small teams who want us to accelerate them, that means 6 months and we'll be helping them, come to us. We'll sit with the Guardian teams, and we just did this last week, and it was a really useful process, getting the input from the Guardian teams about some of the companies that we're going to be taking in. And so that already means you're helping find product market fit very early on in the process. And you've most likely, it's not guaranteed, but most likely to have a very big customer for those companies early on as well. And you're bringing credibility to those startups as well. So the other angle is the bit that's even harder probably is this ideation, for want of a better term, of how you incubate, what are the business models you're going to incubate, and working with the companies on that. And then the really hardest bit is finding who's going to run those companies, which you've alluded to. Who's going to be the founder of that company that's not necessarily their idea. We're not the first people to have conquered this. We mustn't think it's impossible to do that. I have lots of friends of mine who launch like 1 new business a year. It's their idea. They incubate it and they find brilliant MBAs or whatever to run it, and they give them a decent stake of it. So it can be done, but I think the greatest risk is finding that person, which is why we're very focused on keeping up with young talent and young founders.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's why Founders Forum can then lead into the Founders Factory.
And Founders of the Future.
That's right.
And all sort of pieces. And we have a recruitment business, Founders Keepers, as well. And we have a consultancy business, Founders Intelligence, that also works with large corporates, and they pay us to understand how startups are going to disrupt them and to do digital transformation for them. So we get a lot of ways of launching our web, casting our web very wide to understand what's going on globally in these industries.
So you've basically wrapped up business. That's fantastic. It's a good.
Just the digital bit.
That's the nice bit to be in, isn't it? Not the sort of unsexy stuff. Because the Guardian Media Group quoted in the Guardian their own CEO David Pemsel talking about his investment into Founders Factory. Said this strategic investment gives GMG the opportunity to bring emerging technology trends into our own business and culture, giving us access to a global network of startups and the chance to get in early with possible commercial opportunities. So, I mean, this guy is obviously raving about it. The one per industry, is that obviously so you don't get competition and sort of the...
Yeah, initially, actually, when we first thought of the idea, we actually thought we might have multiples per sector. And then we're actually very grateful that the first Macmillan, who came in first, and then The Guardian both said to us, we want the whole sector on our own. It's simpler to manage for us, and for the entrepreneurs, we think it actually gives a clearer path and a clearer way of working. So I think it's better. We now expect to have mostly one per sector. The next two sectors we should be announcing over the next few weeks, we think are taking the whole sector themselves.
Okay, it'll be interesting to see what happens when News Corp offer you 3 times what Guardian Media Group are paying you. Well,
they're locked out now. They're locked out.
Right,
you snooze, you
so you
lose.
better get in
the
there
Guardian
quick.
acted very fast. They move very quickly.
Yeah.
And saw the strategic fit very well.
Yeah, that's why you've been on their board, I guess. They've taken some of the DNA from you. But talking about innovation, so for example, let's just say you're one of those poor companies that are not Guardian Media Group in that space.
Give up now.
Give up, go home. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because you were told back at lastminute.com after the 9/11 crash, I think you were told you guys should just go home.
Give the money back. Our chairman sat Martha and I in a room downstairs in our basement, I remember it, and said, you've got about 50 million, your market cap's about 30. Why don't we just give all the money back? And Martha and I looked at him aghast and we're like, no, the market's mispriced us. We're going to benefit from this change. And
you've got to have that belief, haven't you?
Yeah,
but so talking about those poor companies that are not Guardian Media Group in that sense, and you mentioned, it's not in the DNA of large organisations to sit down and try and work out how they cannibalise themselves and kill themselves. But how should large organisations, get into that sort of habit of innovation, if you like?
Well, it's a mindset, and I think it's an attitude to risk taking. It's an attitude to failure, internal, small failure, learning from your mistakes, all of those things. But it's mostly culture, and by that I really mean attracting the right talent. And I think many corporates that I've seen actually have too long a tenure of employees. I think that's one of the other issues. Is when you get to, I remember saying this to myself, I'd led to other people last minute, when I'm the guy in the meeting who kept saying, we tried this once and it didn't work, then I should go. And I think that you see a lot happening in corporates because there is this almost corporate memory's too good, right? Because they do remember what they tried 6 years ago that it didn't work. It's like, well, actually the world's moved on since then. So I think that's part of it. But we actually advise the corporates to have their own incubation labs. We're saying, yes, you should do innovation internally as well as externally with people like us. We're not quite the only people, but almost the only people. So we think those hybrid models work. But the other bit that we say, and this doesn't have to be done with us, and this is where I think the synergy is wonderful, is corporates should work more with startups. Startups and corporates are a marriage made in heaven, actually, because corporates need that innovation and experimentation, and there are many different ways they can work with startups, and startups need the credibility and gravitas and the ability to scale that corporates can give. So the idea that startups are free R&D for corporates, I think is catching on more now, but I think it went through a sort of cold winter. Right. But I think now we're seeing more of it, which is why, to be honest, for our consultancy business, Founders Intelligence, we often feel like we're pushing on an open door. I remember seeing a very big FTSE 100 company, and the meeting was just perfect. The day before, they had a board meeting saying we need to work more with startups. Right. And then in comes us, and I said to our CEO that, but I said, if we don't convert this one into a client, we really are doing something wrong.
Let's add a few zeros on, because we heard that what they said yesterday. No, that's brilliant. Because studying back in lastminute.com, I again watched an interview with you. I'm not a stalker. I'm just doing my good research on you. Don't worry. Is when you were talking about how you tried voice recognition, and it was a bumpy road, but it seems like you even back then were as the CEO willing to allow things to happen that don't go as smoothly as you'd like in the name of testing. Yeah, I mean, I think it was partly, to be honest, I won't claim to be that clever. I'll claim to love gadgets and love experimentation. So yes, it was. So voice recognition to me was this dream back in 2000, 2001.
where you could talk to our database. And I was like, brilliant. So we tried it. We played around. It was more of a marketing thing at the time. It didn't. Voice recognition just didn't work that well. But we did other things then. Like we had location-based deals on discount deals on WAP phones. If people remember WAP phones. Again, WAP was not ideally suited to this, but we did. And those business models sort of became Groupon and others. So we also did Just Eat's business model before that existed. So we did restaurant food delivery back in 2001. So if anything, I'm disappointed by what's become of that lastminute.com brand. I try not to be, Martha and I try not to be like those two people in the back of the Muppets who used to criticize their past. So, but it's disappointing to think that lastminute.com only launched a mobile app, I think, last year. Yeah. Which is kind of tragic.
So Howard Schultz went back and ran Starbucks. We've got Larry Page went back to Google. If Last Minute, and you've got a lot of ideas for lastminute.com, so would you ever, presumably that would never be on the agenda?
It was talked about a few years ago as it was sold back recently. People did approach me on it. Unfortunately, I think that the bit that needed to be done, which was the sort of spaghetti I helped create, which was we bought 10 businesses or 14 businesses, so there was multiple back offices. There was all that complexity at the back end. Wasn't fixed in 10 years since I sold it. Okay. If that had been fixed, it would have been more exciting because then you could move quickly. Now I actually think there's an opportunity. I think a newer entrant could do what lastminute.com should do, which is everything at the last minute, which the mobile phone is the perfect device for. Better, dare I say it, than Last Minute will be able to do, because I think they're going to be hamstrung by pace.
Well, you must be out of your non-compete by now. You've got Founders Factory.
But looking forward now, I think very quickly after I sold it, I was so obsessed with that I wanted to just keep myself busy on everything else. And it was sold, it was the past, it was absolutely a reasonable ending.
Last question, if I can, Brent, because I know we've only got a certain amount of time with you. Trends, talk about cliches. You said this, I think, at one of the embassy meetings in Helsinki. You said trends are your friends, and I don't know if that was after a few glasses of wine or not, but it's a type of thing. But you have, you rode the internet trend very, very well, and part of innovation, as you know, is all about putting some bets on where the future might be. But how can you keep a finger on the pulse, whether you're CEO of a FTSE 100 or a new startup entrepreneur trying to line your business for the future? How can you have a finger on the pulse of what's coming up next?
Well, I think a finger on the pulse, a lot of it is about getting out there, right? I think too many, and again, I also think CEOs are getting better at this. I think it used to be that they were so rigid. I remember just, for example, trying to get a meeting with a CEO of an airline, and it was like 6 months. I don't think it was just me. Their diaries were so unspontaneous, even in the diary planning, right? So I think it's about them being more spontaneous, getting out there, feeding off, sucking in insights from smart younger people. So I think there's a lot about youth, although I think we've passed the cliche, which is the sort of CEO saying we must do this because my teenager daughter does it. So I hope we're getting more sophisticated in that. But I think lots of the trends are actually the broad trends are pretty obvious, whether it's artificial intelligence or big data or Internet of Things, or that health tech's going to be disrupted and ed tech's going to be disrupted and government as a service is going to be disrupted. There are all these obvious sort of trends, but then it's how do you play into that isn't quite as obvious, and that's where you need to, I think, probably just give your smartest people time to think about it. Take some form of 20% time, this Google idea of, which to be honest, I think many companies had before Google. Even we did this, even lastminute.com. I remember, and in that case, our obsession, it wasn't as sophisticated as Google was saying, but my obsession was keeping prima donnas. So I was like, if there's a really difficult employee, but he's a genius, and what he wanted, he'd come to me and say, Brent, I can't just work on solving someone else's bugs or doing this other thing. I want to work on really hard, difficult problems. And I was like, I'll give them a hard, difficult problem and let them work on something exciting for them just to keep them in the organization. Right. So I think that's another thing that corporates don't do. And those are the sort of ways you keep attuned to the future. It's those I guess it's that Malcolm Gladwell book, Outliers, a bit, right? You want to follow the outliers. It's even going back to one of my first internships at L'Oreal, and a lot of one of the theses of the L'Oreal founder was when you get that discordant anecdote from somewhere way out there, you pay attention to it.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And it goes back to what you were saying right at the beginning about if you hire or you find yourself working with a prima donna that's hard to work with but a creative genius, a lot of people are not willing to work with those type of people because they find them pain in the arse. But great leaders do that.
And they find a way to keep them, absolutely, because they're not scared of them. They know they can channel them in the right way.
That's right. I hope I'm going to be more of a pain in the arse when I get back to work.
Me too.
Brent, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. Thank you, sir. Thank you.